They say kings write history, but sometimes history is written in blood. Imagine this: a queen kneeling on the scaffold, trembling in a thin gown, her hair pinned back to expose the soft flesh of her neck. Around her, the crowd presses forward, not in mourning, but in morbid hunger, waiting to see her head roll into the straw. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, reduced to a trembling body offered up for slaughter. Her crime: daring to deny the king a son. Her punishment: a death so public, so humiliating, that her screams still echo through the centuries. This is not just the story of Anne Boleyn's fall. It is the story of betrayal, lust, and the bloodiest performance ever staged by a king who believed God himself approved of the blade. Anne was not born to be a victim. She rose like fire through the English court, captivating Henry VIII with dark eyes that promised both danger and desire. She laughed where others bowed. She argued where others stayed silent, and in doing so, she lit a spark that consumed the old order of England. Henry defied the Pope for her, broke with Rome, and tore his kingdom apart in the name of her love. But passion that burns too hot always leaves ashes, and Anne's ashes would be stained red with her own blood. By the time she wore the crown, enemies whispered in every corridor. Courtiers spat the word "witch" behind closed doors. Her failure to give Henry a son was a wound that festered into hate. Each miscarriage was treated like proof that God himself cursed her womb. Even her ladies in waiting turned against her, feeding the king rumors that her beauty came from the devil, that her charm was unnatural, that she had seduced him with sorcery. The queen was not just losing favor. She was being painted as a monster. Henry's love curdled into something colder than hatred indifference. His eyes drifted to Jane Seymour, a woman soft and obedient where Anne was sharp and relentless. And Anne, once the king's obsession, became his inconvenience. In Tudor England, a king's inconvenience did not retire quietly. It was destroyed. The trap was set. Her brother George was accused of lying with her. Musicians, courtiers, even a childhood friend were dragged into the net, accused of being her lovers. The charges were absurd, impossible, but truth was irrelevant. This was theatre, staged by Henry, directed by his henchman Thomas Cromwell, designed for one purpose: to erase Anne from history with the slash of a blade. And so the queen, who once commanded the throne, was dragged down into the filth, accused of incest, witchcraft, and treason. The stage was being built for her execution, long before she even knew she had been condemned. The morning of Anne's arrest did not feel like the fall of a queen. It felt like the slaughter of prey. Guards stormed into her chambers with steel in their eyes and orders in their fists. Anne, once surrounded by jewels and silks, was now surrounded by weapons. She demanded to see the king, but Henry was already gone, hunting in the fields, pretending the woman he once tore a kingdom apart for no longer existed. Dragged from her chambers, she stumbled through the court she once ruled. Every pair of eyes turned to her with a mix of satisfaction and fear. They whispered words like adulteress and traitor, as though speaking her guilt made it true. Anne's head was held high, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. She was not just losing her crown. She was walking into a trap designed to break her spirit before the blade even touched her neck. The Tower of London loomed ahead, its stones blackened with centuries of screams. Inside, Anne was locked in the same royal apartments where she had once celebrated her coronation. Now they were her cage. The walls dripped with silence, broken only by the shuffle of guards and the scratching of quills as scribes prepared the lies that would condemn her. Her trial was not about justice. It was theatre. The witnesses brought against her were broken men who had been tortured until their words bled into confessions. Mark Smeaton, the musician who once played for her at court, was stretched until his joints cracked apart, forced to confess he had shared her bed. He later retracted, but the damage was done. Truth did not matter. Henry wanted blood, and Cromwell made sure the script was written. Anne's own brother George was accused of unspeakable crimes. Incest, betrayal, the darkest filth the human tongue could spit. He stood in chains, staring at the Queen, and even in his silence the crowd saw guilt. How could one family be so cursed? How could one woman bring such ruin? These were not questions of law. They were daggers meant to pierce the heart of a queen already bleeding. Day after day, Anne sat in her chamber, waiting, listening. Outside her windows, life in London carried on, the smell of roasting meat, and the cries of market sellers drifting in as though the world had already forgotten her. But inside, the air was heavy with dread. She prayed not for mercy, but for strength to endure what she knew was coming. Because she was no fool. She had seen Henry's cruelty, and she knew that her life was already measured not in days, but in hours. The Tower did not just imprison Anne, it consumed her. Each night, she heard the distant moans of other prisoners, the hollow footsteps of guards who would one day lead her to the block. She pressed her hands together in prayer, but even her faith trembled. Was this God's punishment? Was she, as her enemies claimed, a witch who had cursed the king's bed? Or was she simply a woman destroyed by the very system she had once dared to challenge? When the verdict came, it was read with cold precision, guilty of adultery, incest, and conspiring to kill the king. The words carved into her like blades, not because they were true, but because they were final. The sentence was death, not at Tyburn like a common criminal, but by beheading, because Henry wanted her humiliation swift, clean, and public. He even ordered a French swordsman, famed for his precision, so that the spectacle would be both efficient and unforgettable. Anne wept, but only once. Then she wiped her tears and began to prepare for her end. Queens did not die like common women. Queens died with eyes open, staring straight at the blade. The days between Anne's sentencing and her death were not quiet. They were suffocating. Henry did not give her the dignity of a swift end. He ordered delay after delay, stretching her torment like a rack, letting her mind tear itself apart while she waited for the sword. She woke every morning unsure if it would be her last. The guards gave her no answers. Some days they whispered that the execution would be today. Other days they said it had been postponed. Every hour was a form of torture. Anne was trapped in a nightmare of uncertainty, knowing that death could knock at her door at any moment. She had been a Queen of England, crowned with gold and adored by crowds. Now she paced a prison chamber, whispering prayers to the cold stone walls. At night she begged God for a sign, any sign, that he had not abandoned her. But only silence answered, broken by the echo of footsteps outside her cell. Witnesses said she laughed often in those last days, but the laughter was hollow. It was the sound of a mind cracking under pressure. She joked about her little neck and how the executioner would find it an easy task. But behind the forced humor was terror, terror so sharp it left her unable to sleep. On her final night, Anne knelt for hours in prayer. She whispered confessions, begged forgiveness, and clutched her rosary until her fingers bled. At 2 a.m, she requested the sacrament, desperate to cleanse her soul before dawn. Her ladies said her eyes were bloodshot, her lips trembling as she prayed for her daughter Elizabeth. That child, barely 3 years old, would never again feel her mother's arms. The execution was scheduled, then delayed, then scheduled again. Each postponement was another dagger driven into her chest. The uncertainty broke her down more than chains or whips ever could. She asked her jailers for the hour of her death. They refused to tell her. She lived in a state of constant anticipation, her body shaking at every creak of the door, every flicker of light in the hallway. Meanwhile, Henry prepared to marry Jane Seymour. While Anne prayed in terror, her husband celebrated. While she begged God for mercy, Henry laughed at banquets and hunted in the fields. The king who once risked the wrath of the Pope to marry her now treated her like a rotting corpse, already erased from memory. Her brother George had been executed just days earlier, his body quartered, his head spiked on a gate. Anne knew this. She had been told of his shameful death, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw his broken face, imagining her own following soon after. The tower became her coffin before her body was even laid in the earth. Each moment stripped her down further, her crown gone, her reputation gone, her family slaughtered. All that remained was a woman waiting for the sword, clinging to dignity in a world that had already decided she was less than human. When dawn broke on May 19th, Anne Boleyn was no longer a queen. She was prey, waiting for the kill. The morning of May 19th, 1536, dawned bright and cruel. The sun lit every stone of the Tower of London, as if mocking Anne with its warmth. She had been awake all night, her lips cracked from endless prayer, her eyes red with exhaustion. When the lieutenant of the tower came to fetch her, she was laughing with her ladies. But it was not joy. It was the laughter of someone broken, a final mask over the terror devouring her from the inside. The path from her cell to Tower Green was short, but every step was a knife. 3 years earlier, she had walked this same ground as queen, draped in velvet and jewels. Now guards surrounded her, not out of respect, but to keep her from running. Courtiers who had once bowed before her now sneered, their silence colder than any insult. The scaffold loomed ahead, just 3 feet high. Deliberately built low, it robbed her of the dignity of height, keeping her close to the jeering crowd. And the crowd had gathered in droves. Hundreds pressed in, craning their necks for a better view. It was not solemn mourning. It was theater. They had been told their queen was a witch, a traitor, an adulteress. And now they came to watch her fall. The air was thick with noise catcalls, jeers, mocking laughter. Some shouted for the sword to strike quickly. Others spat as Anne passed. She kept her head high, though her lips trembled, whispering prayers no one could hear. The scaffold smelled of death. Blood stains from past executions darkened the wood, blackened in the sunlight, buzzing with flies. Anne would have seen them as she mounted the steps. She would have smelled the iron tang of dried blood and heard the buzzing swarm that feasted on the ghosts of men and women who had come before her. When she reached the top, the crowd quieted. Tradition demanded a final speech, and Anne gave one. Her voice was clear, though her hands shook. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die." She began, but the words were not her own. They were carefully chosen, forced upon her by the weight of politics. She praised the king who had condemned her. She declared herself obedient to the law that had fabricated her crimes. Her last speech was not freedom of expression. It was censorship at the edge of a blade. And then the final cruelty. Anne was blindfolded, not out of mercy, but to prevent her from flinching. She would not even see death coming. Instead, she knelt upright, her body trembling as she whispered her last prayer. The crowd leaned forward, hungry. The French swordsman stood ready, his blade gleaming in the sun. He had practiced for this, paid handsomely for the cleanest cut. Anne, blindfolded, tried to sense the moment, her lips moving in frantic prayer. Witnesses swore her eyes darted beneath the cloth, searching for a sound, a signal, anything that would tell her when the sword would fall. The silence before the strike was worse than the blade itself. The waiting, the terror, the prayer cut short by steel. And then, one stroke. The sword flashed. The head fell. Blood sprayed across the scaffold, dripping into the grass below. Some in the crowd screamed. Others fainted. The executioner held her head aloft by the hair, her lips still moving, her eyes still flickering with the last sparks of life. For a moment, Anne Boleyn existed between life and death, a severed head that would not stop praying. Her ladies rushed forward, weeping, scrambling to gather the head and body. No coffin had been prepared. They shoved her remains into an old arrow chest, like discarded scraps. No royal burial, no dignity, just haste, fear, and shame. Anne Boleyn, once the Queen of England, was gone. But the horror of her execution was only beginning. The sword had fallen, but Anne's torment didn't end there. Her body, once draped in royal silk, now lay headless on the blood-soaked scaffold. Her ladies, in waiting, pale and shaking, rushed to gather what was left of their mistress. They wept as they cradled her severed head, wrapping it in cloth with trembling hands. But there was no coffin waiting, no funeral procession, no dignity. The executioners hadn't even bothered to prepare a proper burial. In desperation, her attendants found an old arrow chest, an empty wooden box used for holding weapons. That was where England's queen was stuffed like a broken doll tossed aside. Her head and body, jammed together, unwashed, unblessed, shoved under the chapel floor of St. Peter ad Vincula. A queen buried like trash, in a grave unmarked. Nameless, forgotten. The horror of Anne's death was meant to vanish quickly, replaced with spectacle. As her blood still seeped into the scaffold wood, Henry VIII was already celebrating. In Whitehall, the king wore white, a colour of joy. He feasted. He laughed. He made preparations for his marriage to Jane Seymour. Within 24 hours of his wife's execution, he was betrothed again. Within 2 weeks, he was remarried. The message was clear: Anne Boleyn was nothing, disposable, erased. But Henry didn't stop at killing her body. He killed her legacy. Orders were sent to have her portraits destroyed. Her emblems were ripped from palace walls. Her name was spoken in whispers, as if cursed. Courtiers who had once praised her beauty now called her a witch, an adulteress, a monster who deserved her fate. Even her daughter Elizabeth, barely 3 years old, was declared a bastard and stripped of her royal title. The child was left in rags, abandoned in status, as though her mother's blood tainted her. What Anne endured in life was brutal, but what followed in death was annihilation. Henry's propaganda machine ensured that she was not just executed, but erased from memory itself. And yet, she could not be silenced forever. Her ladies who had cleaned her blood, who had buried her body in shame, never forgot the horror. Some carried nightmares of that day for the rest of their lives. One entered a convent, unable to face the world, after seeing a queen butchered like cattle. Others whispered the truth in secret, passing down the memory of a woman wronged beyond measure. Henry thought he had destroyed Anne Boleyn, but he underestimated the power of history. Because centuries later, the truth would rise from the shadow of the axe. The scaffold had silenced Anne Boleyn's voice. Her body was broken, her blood spilled, her reputation destroyed. Henry VIII believed he had won. He thought he had erased her, buried her in a box like a common criminal, and smeared her name until no one dared speak it with respect. To him, Anne Boleyn was gone forever. But death can be the beginning of something greater. Anne's execution was designed to shock, to terrify, to serve as a warning that no one, not even a queen, could defy the king. And yet, in the centuries that followed, the axe that struck her down only sharpened her legend. The very daughter Henry tried to disinherit, Elizabeth, would one day climb onto the throne he tried to deny her. And with her coronation, the blood of Anne Boleyn returned to rule England. Elizabeth I became one of the greatest monarchs in history. The Virgin Queen, who forged an empire, defeated the Spanish Armada, and presided over an age of unmatched culture and power. Every victory Elizabeth won was a ghostly echo of her mother's vengeance. Anne had been slaughtered, but her bloodline endured, and it was her daughter who brought the Tudor dynasty to its peak. And Henry. His reputation decayed. The king who had once strutted like a god was remembered as a tyrant, a man consumed by lust, paranoia, and cruelty. Anne's death became one of his darkest stains, a reminder of how far a monarch would go to crush the woman who once captured his heart. But the brutality of Anne's end still chills us centuries later. Imagine the sound of that blade slicing through her neck, the gasp of the crowd, the trembling hands of her ladies as they stuffed her body into a crude arrow chest. That image refuses to fade, no matter how much Henry tried to bury it. Anne Boleyn's story survives because it is not just about death. It is about betrayal, power, and the cost of ambition. It is about a woman who rose from the shadows of the court to wear a crown, only to be destroyed by the very man who put it on her head. And in the end, the blood that spilled onto that scaffold did not silence her. It immortalized her. Today, tourists still stand before the Tower of London, staring at the place where Anne was executed. Some say they feel a chill, as if her ghost still lingers, watching, waiting, whispering her truth. Her legacy has become more powerful than Henry ever imagined. He killed her body, but he could never kill her story. So remember this: the blood of Anne Boleyn watered the roots of England's future. A brutal execution meant to erase her, instead ensured she would never be forgotten. The axe took her life, but history gave her revenge.